member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This is Labor adopting a Greens policy. By reducing Export Finance Australia's flexibility, this legislation puts our national security objectives in the Pacific at risk. Do you think other Pacific powers have hamstrung themselves in this same way? No, not a chance, Deputy Speaker. This bill could also force Infrastructure Australia to prioritise less emissions-intensive public transport projects in urban areas over major road projects in regional areas, or new ports or airports. The experience in the UK, the United Kingdom, has seen activists delay the construction of Britain's new high-speed rail network, HS2. The experience in the UK has seen activists challenge the UK government's plan to invest in road maintenance and the construction of new roads, because this could lead to increased traffic and thus greater emissions. The experience in the UK has seen activists successfully delay the construction of a third runway at Heathrow Airport, delaying that construction for years. Now, that case had to go all the way to the UK's equivalent of our High Court before it was finally thrown out. These are the consequences of legislating targets. The bill before the House could also restrict the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, the NAIF, from supporting an expansion of our traditional export industries, particularly energy and agriculture. To that, no doubt, the Greens would say fine, because they don't like coal and gas anyway. But this legislation will also hamper the development of clean energy industries too. Take the example of critical minerals processing. The former coalition government prioritised the development of new critical minerals processing projects as part of the government's $2.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy. But critical minerals processing can be harmful to the environment. It is also energy intensive and therefore emissions intensive. So what does that mean? If you apply the same rules Labor and the Greens would like to apply to coal and gas to new critical minerals projects, how could these agencies support projects that increase Australia's emissions? The problem is they are seeking to legislate something that will hamper not just Australia's competitive advantage, but progress with clean energy technologies. If they apply that rule, which they are suggesting they are, then suddenly critical minerals processing comes under question. And, Deputy Speaker, at a time of heightened volatility and uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific, with rising interest rates and a stalling economic recovery under this Labor government, not to mention a global energy crisis, this is absolute madness. This Prime Minister and his Climate Change Minister have been so focused on the politics, they've forgotten to think about the consequences of this legislation. The Coalition, for our part, we remain absolutely open to sensible policies that reduce power prices and support economic growth while reducing emissions. When we were in government, we exceeded our emissions target despite not legislating them. despite not legislating them. When we left office, emissions were lower than ever before, at more than 20% below 2005 levels. We reduced our emissions faster than many of our peers, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, just to mention a few. And as a reminder to the government that has walked away from tackling prices, the coalition also drove prices down. Power prices dropped by 8%. Power prices dropped by 8% for households, between 10 and 12% for businesses, and that was just over the last term of the coalition government. Yet the Labor government went to the election promising even lower prices, only to abandon that promise in week 1 of the first sitting of the new parliament. But the coalition, at the end of the day, will not support legislation that puts our energy and national security at risk or our economy. Now, there are a range of other concerns, Deputy Speaker, that the coalition has regarding this legislation, and that includes its lack of equity and balance. First, if the bills were equitable, they would account for the economic consequences of higher energy prices and their impact on Australian businesses, investments and jobs, along with the households and families and the basic way of life for everyday Australians. But these bills do not account for any of these things. What the government must not forget is that when power prices rise, they disproportionately impact those who can afford them least. In other words, if Labor does not accept that economics need to be taken into account with these bills, then surely they must consider the moral consequences of what they wish to implement. Labor's policy to achieve the objectives laid out in these bills also require the construction of new facilities and transmission lines across the country. These will have a direct impact on countless local communities, including in the Minister for Infrastructure's electorate of Ballarat. And yet the bills before the House lack any requirement for the Minister to report to the Parliament on how the implementation of the government's policies affects these communities. There is no requirement for the government to take into account the effect of implementing these policies on regional communities or even agricultural land. Secondly, if these bills were balanced, they would reflect a technology-agnostic approach that encourages free enterprise, promoting entrepreneurship, research and development. Sadly, however, the Albanese Labor government has abandoned the technology investment roadmap process and the cost reduction targets that the former coalition government put in place. This is what you get from the Albanese Bant government in the bills that we see before the House. The new government has also removed any references to reducing the cost of new and emerging technologies from its NDC. Indeed, much of the investments initiated by the former coalition government are now under review. The Labor government has no plan to reduce the cost of deploying new and emerging low-emissions technologies. And it's not just the balance of technologies that count, Deputy Speaker. It's also the balance of burden, the economic burden that is to be carried. Labor's policy to achieve the objectives laid out in the bill include applying punitive penalties against selected sectors of the economy and by extension to their communities and their workers. I'm not just talking here about Labor's proclivity for increases in taxation, as reflected in the changes they plan to make to the safeguard mechanism. Not content with removing safeguards from the bills, Labor has actively removed all safeguards from their updated 2022 NDC. This government and this minister are actively avoiding scrutiny. Deputy Speaker, when you consider all the possible adverse consequences of this bill, it makes you wonder why the government wants to introduce legislation that it has itself called unnecessary. Seeking to reduce emissions without accounting for the economic impact, the price impact on businesses and families is foolishness of the highest order. And it represents a derogation of duty on the part of the government. The Coalition has initiated a review of its climate and energy policies. Any new emissions reduction targets or policies to achieve them that the Coalition takes to the next election will reflect the latest economic developments and emissions projections. They will also account for the role that new and emerging technologies could play in an Australian context. A least cost approach to reducing emissions means that all technologies must be on the table. That includes carbon capture and also advanced nuclear power technologies, both of which feature in the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU's plans to get to net zero emissions. To summarise, if I may, Deputy Speaker, Labor has made it very clear that they will not honour the commitment they made to the Australian people just over 2 months ago. We have already learnt in this first sitting of the Parliament their intention to break a promise of reducing power bills by $275. This is the Albanese Labor government's first broken promise. They went to an election with a climate change policy that included two parts: a 43% reduction in emissions and a $275 reduction in power bills. The Parliament opens. They furnish, they table their legislation to enable this climate change policy. But there is no mention of price. There is no mention of that economic consequence, making this legislation effectively a broken promise. Also, Deputy Speaker, we know that this bill is not about the target, it's not about the 2030 target, because the 2030 target of 43% has already been set by the new government. The United Nations has been informed. This bill, no matter how people vote on it, will not have one bit of difference, will not make one iota of difference to the 43% target that has been set by the government. It's completely at the prerogative of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to change that target, and they have. So this is not about the target. It's not about the 43. This is about the legislation. And Labor has caved in to the Greens, and in doing so, it is prepared to put at risk communities, projects, jobs, intellectual property staying in Australia. This is what they have at risk. The consequences of their consequential amendment bill is a scary prospect, Deputy Speaker, and one the government has not thought through. This ultimately is a legislation that comes as nothing more than a political stunt. The Coalition will always support policies to bring down emissions, but we will not do it where we compromise our economy and our national security.